Imagine the acrid smell of burning animal fat, the clamor of thousands of voices in prayer, the incessant clinking of silver and gold coins changing hands, blood flowing through carefully carved stone channels. Welcome to the Temple of Jerusalem in the first century. Not merely a sacred sanctuary, but the largest financial center in the Middle East. And this was no exception. From the Parthenon in Athens to the colossal temples of Thebes, the houses of the gods were also treasuries, banks, and centers of economic redistribution that moved wealth equivalent to entire national GDPs. But here's the question. Archaeologists and economic historians have been wrestling with for decades. Where did all that gold go? All those animals? All those tons of grain, wine, incense, and silver? The answer reveals one of the most sophisticated and carefully concealed economic systems in ancient history. When we think of religious sacrifices, we picture mystical rituals, smoke rising to the heavens, priests in ceremonial robes murmuring prayers. We rarely think about logistics, about accounting, about trade routes and exchange rates. But we should, because behind every smoking altar was a ledger. Behind every priest, an accountant. The temples of antiquity weren't just spiritual centers. They were the ancient world's first multinational corporations, operating on a scale that would make any modern conglomerate envious. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they're staggering. At the Temple of Jerusalem, during the 3 great annual pilgrimage festivals, conservative estimates suggest that 250,000 animals were sacrificed within a matter of weeks. Sheep, cattle, doves, goats. The historian Josephus recorded that during Passover in the year 66 CE, 256,000 lambs were slaughtered in a single day. Put that in perspective, that's roughly 3 lambs being killed every second for 12 straight hours. The infrastructure needed to process this volume rivals a modern industrial slaughterhouse. Drainage channels, washing areas, distribution systems. Archaeologists have discovered beneath the Temple Mount a network of tunnels and cisterns capable of processing millions of gallons of water daily. We're not talking about symbolic rituals here. We're talking about operations on an industrial scale. But animals were only a fraction of the offerings. There was gold and silver in quantities that defy imagination. When the Roman general Pompey stormed the Temple of Jerusalem in 63 BCE, his troops found 2,000 talents of gold in the sanctuary treasury. A single talent weighed roughly 57 pounds. Do the math. That's over 50 tons of pure gold. By today's prices, we're talking more than $3 billion. And that was just what was visible. Historical records suggest far more was hidden in underground chambers that have never been fully mapped. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi accumulated similar wealth over centuries. Every Greek city-state that consulted the oracle left offerings proportional to the gravity of their questions. Entire treasuries were built just to house donations from Athens, Corinth, Thebes. Stone inscriptions catalog items of astronomical value. Bronze tripods inlaid with gold, ivory statues, crowns studded with precious gems. So we circle back to the central question, what happened to all of it? The answer isn't simple because there were multiple destinations and all of them reveal fascinating aspects of ancient economics. First, a significant portion was literally consumed, destroyed. In the case of burnt offerings, the entire sacrifice went up in flames, whole oxen reduced to ashes, tons of incense transformed into smoke. This might seem like monumental waste to our modern sensibilities, but it had a twisted economic logic. By publicly destroying wealth on a massive scale, temples and their patrons demonstrated absolute power. It was the ancient equivalent of burning cash to prove you can. A display of wealth so excessive it established social hierarchies beyond question. If you could afford to incinerate an entire ox when your family could live off the meat for weeks, you weren't just wealthy, you were untouchable. But here's where it gets interesting. Most sacrifices weren't burnt offerings, they were shared sacrifices. And this is where the economic system becomes truly ingenious. In Greece and Rome, most sacrifices followed a specific pattern. A small portion of the animal, usually internal organs and fat, was burned on the altar for the gods. The rest was divided up. The priest got specific cuts, typically the choicest parts: thigh, loin, breast. The remainder was distributed among ritual participants or sold in markets right next to the temples. Archaeologists have identified in the ruins of Greek and Roman temples structures that can only be described as sacred butcher shops. Bronze hooks for hanging carcasses, marble cutting tables, sales areas with standardized weights and measures. The Temple of Apollo in Corinth had an entire commercial complex attached where sacrificial meat was sold at fixed prices. The Apostle Paul, in his letters to early Christian communities, wrestled with exactly this dilemma. Was it ethical for Christians to buy meat sold in temple markets, knowing it came from pagan sacrifices? The question wasn't some abstract theological puzzle. It was intensely practical, because in many cities most of the available meat came from exactly these sources. The system created a self-sustaining economic engine. More sacrifices meant more meat on the market. More meat on the market meant it became more affordable to the general population. More affordable meat meant more people could participate in religious festivals that required sacrifices, and more participation meant more revenue for the temples. It was a perpetual motion machine disguised as piety. The priests were, in practice, the biggest meat distributors in ancient cities. And there were surprisingly modern regulations governing all of this. Inscriptions found at Delphi spell out laws about meat quality, sales windows, penalties for priests who skimmed more than their allotted share. The bureaucracy of the sacred was remarkably detailed. Consider a family in 1st century Jerusalem. Let's call them the family of Yosef, a stonemason. It's nearly Passover, and like every Jewish household, they're required to sacrifice a lamb. But not just any lamb. It has to be perfect. Unblemished. Yosef walks to the animal markets near the temple, his 7-year-old son trailing behind him. The boy has never seen so many sheep in one place. Thousands of them, bleeding, pressing against wooden pens. Yosef approaches a dealer, one of dozens lining the plaza. The dealer sizes him up immediately. Working class, can't afford much. He shows Yosef a lamb. It looks fine to Yosef's untrained eye. The dealer quotes a price. It's steep, but manageable. Yosef nods, reaches for his coin purse. But then a temple inspector appears. He's one of the priests trained to certify animals for sacrifice. He examines the lamb Yosef has chosen, runs his fingers through the wool, checks the eyes, the hooves, then shakes his head. There's a small scar on the animal's leg. Barely visible, but it's there. The lamb is blemished. Unsuitable. The inspector moves on. The dealer shrugs, apologetic. He shows Yosef another lamb. This one is certified perfect. The price is triple what the first one cost. Yosef feels his stomach drop. He doesn't have that much, not even close. The dealer reads his face. He leans in, voice dropping. There's an option, he says. The temple offers loans, short-term, reasonable rates. Yosef can borrow what he needs, fulfill his religious obligation, pay it back over time. What choice does he have? It's Passover. His family has to participate. To refuse would be unthinkable. So Yosef walks to the money changers, his son still beside him, watching everything. He borrows the difference, signs a contract he can barely read, buys the perfect lamb, and as he leads the animal toward the court of the Gentiles, toward the altar where it will be slaughtered, he's already calculating how many extra jobs he'll need to take, how many months it will take to pay off the debt. The lamb bleats softly. His son reaches out to touch its wool, and Yosef realizes with a sick clarity that the system isn't designed for him. It's designed to extract from him. The gods may get the smoke, but the temple gets everything else. This wasn't an anomaly, this was the system, refined over centuries to maximize both piety and profit. And the genius of it was that questioning it felt like questioning God himself. Now let's talk about the gold and silver, because this is where the system gets even more complex. Temples functioned as the world's first banks. Not metaphorically, literally. Citizens deposited gold in temples because they were the safest places around. Thick walls, armed guards, And most importantly, the certainty that stealing from a god would bring down curses no rational thief would risk. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, was also the Mediterranean's largest bank. Merchants from across Asia Minor deposited their fortunes there, and the temple didn't just store the gold, it loaned it out, with interest. We have clay contracts showing the Temple of Artemis financing trade expeditions, shipbuilding projects, even military campaigns. The standard interest rate was 12% annually, not too far off from credit card rates in some economies today. The Temple of Jerusalem operated similarly, though with theological quirks. Mosaic law forbade charging interest on loans between Jews, but there was no restriction on lending to Gentiles. The temple got around this through clever legal fiction. They offered loans without nominal interest, but charged administrative fees that conveniently added up to roughly market rate interest. Semantically kosher, economically pragmatic. The temple also held a monopoly on currency exchange. Pilgrims came from all over the Roman Empire carrying denarii, drachmas, shekels from different regions. But temple offerings could only be made in Tyrian coinage, considered the purest in silver content. The temple money changers charged a conversion fee, and that fee, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of pilgrims each year, generated massive revenue. When Jesus of Nazareth flipped the tables of the money changers, he wasn't just making a theological point. He was striking at the financial engine of the entire system. But there's something even more remarkable. Temples also served as agricultural credit unions. In Ptolemaic Egypt, temples like the one dedicated to Ptah at Memphis would loan grain to farmers during lean seasons. Farmers repaid after harvest, with a 20% markup. But if the harvest failed due to drought or flooding, the temple absorbed the loss. It was an early form of crop insurance. The system stabilized regional economies, prevented famines, and massively increased temple power. These institutions became creditors to entire communities. Generations of families lived in perpetual debt to organizations that theoretically existed only to serve the gods. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary critics. The philosopher Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BCE, penned scathing observations about priests growing fat while preaching detachment from worldly things. There was also a whole international dimension to this economy. Major temples functioned as nodes in transcontinental trade networks. The incense burned at the Jerusalem temple came from Arabia Felix, modern-day Yemen, hauled by caravans across brutal deserts. The ivory in Greek temple statues came from sub-Saharan Africa. The lapis lazuli adorning Egyptian priestly garments came from Afghanistan, over 2,000 miles away. Temples didn't just consume these luxury goods. They controlled the trade routes, financed the caravans, taxed the transactions. They were, in effect, international trading corporations wrapped in religious authority. And that religious authority was incredibly effective cover. Who's going to question the needs of the gods? If Apollo demanded Phoenician incense instead of Arabian, that wasn't up for debate. Even if Phoenician incense cost 3 times as much, and the main importers happened to be families tied to the Delphic priesthood, recent archaeological work has brought even more fascinating details to light. Excavations beneath the Temple Mount uncovered bone deposits from sacrificial animals that literally measured several feet high. Forensic analysis revealed the animals came from specialized breeding operations, some located hundreds of miles away. There were entire farms dedicated exclusively to raising ceremonially pure animals for the sacrifice market. And quality control was rigorous. Animals with any defect got rejected. This created a luxury market where a flawless lamb for sacrifice could run 10 times the price of an ordinary food lamb. Poor families wanting to meet their religious obligations had to go into debt to buy acceptable animals, and who did they borrow from? The very temples where they'd be making the sacrifice. The system was brilliantly, brutally circular. And of course there was corruption. With this much money flowing through the system, it would be naive to think otherwise. Historical records are loaded with scandals. Priests selling temple positions, dealers doctoring blemished animals with dye and cosmetics to pass inspection, embezzlement of offerings. Josephus describes, with barely concealed disgust, High priests in Jerusalem living like Greek princes while ordinary people struggled to eat. There's one particularly ugly account of high priests sending enforcers to violently seize tithes meant for lower-ranking priests, leaving them destitute. The system generated inequality even within the priestly class. Regular priests scraped by on tips. High priests amassed fortunes that rivaled royalty. At Delphi, modern analysis of temple inscriptions has revealed elaborate schemes of oracular fraud. Wealthy clients could bribe the priestesses to deliver favorable prophecies. There were under-the-table price lists. Basic consultations cost X, war prophecies cost 10X, divine endorsement of political coups cost 100X. The oracle that supposedly guided the fate of empires was, at least partly, pay-to-play theater. And here's the kicker. There's evidence people knew. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, tells stories of envoys who tested the oracle by asking questions they already knew the answers to, just to check if it was legit. Skepticism existed, but the institution was too powerful to challenge openly. As the Roman Empire expanded, it gradually absorbed and secularized many of these temple functions. Private banks began competing. Municipal slaughterhouses cut into the priestly monopoly on meat. But the transition was slow and incomplete. Even in the 4th century CE, after Christianity became Rome's official religion, plenty of pagan temples still operated as financial institutions. And Christianity itself, ironically, ended up replicating much of the model. Medieval monasteries became bankers, landowners, trade brokers. The underlying structure was too resilient to simply disappear. It just switched deities. There's a particularly telling find from Pompey, frozen in time by volcanic ash. In the Temple of Isis, archaeologists discovered a strong box containing coins, jewelry, and something unexpected: loan documents. Contracts listing debts Pompeian citizens owed the temple. Interest rates, payment schedules, collateral. And in the next room over, votive offerings. Little statues left by people who'd been healed or found lost items or survived dangers. The juxtaposition is striking. In the same building, genuine faith and cold financial calculation existed side by side without any apparent contradiction. For the ancients, there was no hypocrisy here. The gods needed houses. Houses needed upkeep. Upkeep required money. And money needed professional management. Sacred and secular weren't opposites, they were partners. Maybe the deepest insight from all this is what it tells us about power. Whoever controls the sacred controls the economy. Whoever controls the economy controls politics. And whoever controls politics gets to define what's sacred. Ancient temples were the gears at the center of this machine. They legitimized kings through ritual, financed wars through loans, stabilized markets through grain and meat redistribution. In return, they got tax exemptions, legal protection, trade monopolies. It was perfect symbiosis between throne and altar. And when that symbiosis cracked, empires shook. The Jewish revolt against Rome in 66 CE started, tellingly, when priests refused to accept sacrifices offered in the emperor's name. Rome read this correctly. It wasn't just religious rebellion, it was a declaration of economic independence. The response was total war. Rome leveled the Jerusalem temple and dismantled an economic system that had operated for 1,000 years. The offerings burned away. The gold was looted or hidden so well it's never been recovered. The priests died and their bloodlines faded, but the questions linger, echoing across millennia, just as unanswered now as they were then. Maybe that's the real treasure worth seeking. Not in buried vaults beneath ruined temples, but in understanding why we built those temples to begin with. Why we still do. What we're actually sacrificing and for whom. Because that fusion of religion and economics, that blending of altar and marketplace, didn't end when Rome torched the Jerusalem temple. It transformed. In the decades after that destruction, as Jewish communities scattered and a new movement began spreading across the empire, something unprecedented happened. The temple system had been vast but localized. What came next was far more dangerous, an idea that spread like wildfire, challenging not just how temples operated, but whether you even needed temples at all. The carpenter from Nazareth had already lit that fuse. And Rome, pragmatic and brutal as always, faced a choice: crush this movement or weaponize it. The answer would reshape the entire world. To understand exactly how the empire seized control of this power and turned a religious threat into their greatest weapon, watch the next episode, From Temple to Empire: How Rome Hijacked the Faith. The master plan is waiting. This documentary is based on historical research, archaeological sources, and verifiable documents. Images and videos generated by artificial intelligence were used to illustrate and dramatize historical events.